Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Adrian Pandev, business and immigration attorney, and in this video we're going to talk about the most common reasons for E-2 visa denials. Now I understand this is the topic everyone that's applying for an E-2 visa is most anxious about. This is the one thing everyone wants to avoid. Nobody wants to get a denial. So that being said, let's dive right into this subject. Now, as background, let's go through the E-2 visa requirements one more time, right? An E-2 visa is issued to a treaty country national, so you have to be a citizen of a treaty country. You have to make a substantial at-risk investment, right? At-risk meaning it's not passive, it's committed, not just money sitting on a bank account or other passive investment. It's money you've put at risk into this business. The business itself has to be real, active, and ready to operate upon issuance of the visa. And you have to be entering to direct and develop this business. And finally, the business cannot be marginal. And what that means is it must generate enough income to support more than you, the investor, and your family. So think of it as a business that's capable of hiring employees and providing a living for others than yourself. Okay, now let's dive into the most common reasons for E-2 visa denials. One of the major reasons or most common reasons is just insufficient invested funds, right? So the officer reads the business plan, they listen to you during the interview, and they determine that the amount of capital invested is insufficient for this business, and they don't believe that the business will be able to scale based on this investment amount. Now, keep in mind, for the E-2 visa, there's no minimum investment amount, but the requirement is that you make a substantial investment. There's no figure given, but the investment still has to be substantial. So the best way to approach this, first of all, I guess it's important to note that for this category of denials, it's fairly easy to cure in most cases, because generally either if in fact there wasn't a big capital cash investment, then generally speaking, clients are able to cure the defect by investing additional capital. In other cases, and I see this more frequently, there are cases where the business actually in fact needs more capital, it just requires a better explanation of how the funds were used and how any passive funds, because a lot of times when I see pushback on insufficient funds, it means that there's cash just sitting on a bank account, just idle cash, right? That's not really counted as at-risk committed investment. Then an explanation can be provided how that cash will be used, right? So simply put, although these denials occur and officers push back on investment amount, generally speaking, this can be cured by offering a better explanation of how the funds were used and what they will be used for if there's a passive component. And also, if necessary, generally speaking, the invested amount can be increased and thereby satisfying the requirement, right? One quick note on this. This is arguably the most important part of the whole E-2 case, like figuring out the strategy around the invested capital, right? How much capital will be invested and how it will be used. So it is something that you should definitely work on if you haven't applied for an E-2 visa yet, because at the end of the day, it is an investor visa and it does come down to money invested. So it's important to have a good strategy on how much money and why it's enough to grow this business. Another common E-2 denial reason that I see when individuals approach me after a denial is marginality, right? The business has to generate enough income that goes beyond the investor and their family. So often, if in the business plan it's not well explained, and not just the business plan, I guess all the supporting documents, right? If they don't explain in detail how the invested amount is sufficient to launch this business and how this business will scale to a point where it needs to employ U.S. workers and needs to create a living for others than the U.S. worker, well, then the officer can push back. I see this a lot with individuals who are applying with sort of very specialized professional services consulting needs, where in the business plan and in the application documents, it's not well explained how the business is going to go beyond the individual investor who is providing the service. So let's use a lawyer as an example, right? If you're a lawyer, the business will depend on you because you're providing that professional service. If you're unable to explain how you're going to create jobs for other lawyers, other professionals, assistants, paralegals, whatever it may be, right? Well, then the business may be marginal because the E-2 visa does require that the business provide for more than just you and your family down the line, right? So basically, if in your business plan and all your documents you've not explained how the business is going to go beyond just you working for the business and you providing that specialized service, that will be an issue, and that's where you get the pushback on marginality. Again, it can be cured, and I actually think this is one of the denial reasons that are easier to cure, because it's very rare for a business to only need one person, right, to provide a service. It's generally a team, and generally any business will benefit from employees. So when it comes to, if you've received a denial regarding marginality, know that it can be cured, and it generally requires a better explanation of how the business will grow beyond you and your involvement in the business. Another reason that I see that comes up for denials is basically a weak business plan. And it's not just a business plan, it's all the supporting documents explaining what the business will do. In these cases, what happens is the officer does not understand the business, and your goal with all of these documents you're submitting and at the interview is to explain, right, how you determined how much money the business needed, how the funds were used, how these funds will create a business that will grow to the point that it needs to employ U.S. workers, right, so that the business is not deemed marginal. And think of this E-2 business plan. I always tell all my clients this. It's not a real, it's not a business plan like your conventional business plan, right, that are used by companies. It does have a lot of the same components, but it focuses much more on how the business will meet the E-2 requirements, right? So it talks about, hiring strategy is a critical component. The initial investment is a critical component because it has to show how all of the criteria are met, right, for the E-2 visa. So one comment I have here is that some businesses are just much more complex than others, right? If you're opening up, a restaurant, a retail business, e-commerce, a lot of these type of businesses come up very frequently in the E-2 context, and officers are used to them. Now, some businesses are just very unique and they have many moving parts. Sometimes you have a fairly complex organizational structure, right, where you have multiple businesses within it. In those cases, this E-2 business plan becomes even more important. So I'm just flagging this because your goal is to make the officer easily understand what the business will do and also how your investment will help this business achieve its goals and scale, right? And the business plan becomes the most critical document in this whole process. Similarly to the marginality pushback, when it comes to the business plan, right, and then the officer not understanding what the business will do and how the investment will allow the business to achieve its goals, it's fairly easy to cure, right? You just have to sort of repackage everything and re-explain and perhaps illustrate what the business will do and how the investment will allow this business to achieve its goals through this business plan, and just do it a little bit better. Another reason for E-2 denials is incomplete documentation. So I see this a lot when people schedule consultations with me and they've gotten pushback on their E-2 visa. And this is basically the paper trail, right? Like this is, to put it bluntly, the lawyer's job, right? To try to document how, the lawful source of funds for the investment, showing how the funds were committed. So, how the funds got into the business bank account, showing bank statements, credit card statements, etc., showing the transactions, how the cash was spent on the various expenses, showing how the money was put at risk. This involves receipts, invoices, bank statements, etc. You basically need immaculate documentation. And if you have that, you're going to make the officer's life easier, because they will see that, yes, in fact, here's my substantial investment. Here are all the expenses, neatly organized, no questions asked. Money was put at risk. Money was committed. E-2 visa requirements are met, right? So this, if you get pushback on the documentation, as long as the investments are there and the funds were at risk and are committed, I find this, again, an easier defect to cure, simply because it just means that you just need to work through the documents rather than there being something substantially wrong with the case itself. The final common E-2 visa denial reason I see is the E-2 interview. So at the interview, the officer will be asking questions about the business plan, the investment, and other questions the officer may have about the application. And sometimes what I see is, right, some officers only ask some very specific direct questions. Maybe the applicant wasn't prepared to answer those questions. Maybe the applicant isn't well prepared for that interview. And I see this fairly frequently where I have a consultation with someone where I review the application materials that were submitted and the case seems quite strong, but then talking to the applicant, you realize that during the interview, the business plan was not communicated particularly well, or maybe not particularly well, but to the officer's satisfaction, right? Because the goal is to convince the officer that the requirements are met, right? This is fairly rare, I'll be honest, compared to the other reasons I mentioned in this video. This is probably the rarest one. But all I want to say here is obviously that this one is easier to cure for sure, because you generally don't have to change too much in the application documents. You can even just resubmit it. But I want to stress the interview preparation, right? So I think it's very important to be well rested for these interviews and have and sort of practice how you will explain this business, right? Because yes, we have everything in writing, but I think the investor, the owner explaining this business goes a really long way, right? And the confidence of that individual, I think, can go a really long way at these interviews. So it's important to be well prepared for your E-2 visa interview. My final comment here after going through all these denials is that you shouldn't worry. So if there is a deficiency, the officer will most likely tell you at the end of your interview and will allow you to cure it. So basically the officer will tell you, if you submit these additional documents, then I will be able to approve the case. So in those cases where that happens, just make sure you file a strong response, listing all those documents, organizing them well, so that the officer can approve the case. Also, if your E-2 visa is denied, right, absolute worst case scenario, that does not mean you cannot reapply. So if your case is denied, you should definitely ask the officer why, so that you can know what you need to fix, and then you can prepare the case again, focus on the areas where there was a deficiency according to the officer, and you can go ahead and resubmit the case. Just a comment on this video, the goal of this video wasn't to scare you with all these reasons for denials, but more to alert you where E-2 cases can fall short of the requirements and where officers can push back. And the goal obviously is for you, after you made this investment and you're obviously committed to your US business, to avoid this denial. So the goal again was not to scare you, but more to highlight the areas that you should definitely focus on in your E-2 visa application. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. If you have additional comments or other topics you want me to cover, please put them in the comments, and I would really appreciate it if you could hit the follow button and like this video. Thank you so much for watching.